Hallelujah, hallelujah. Brothers who came to New Mexico had an idea of carrying on a mission, an apostolate, and to really affect the whole area. What I'm going to talk about now for the next hour or so is going to deal with efforts to expand the work. And I think they show the spirit of the brothers, and also I think they show a determination. Let's try something. Didn't work. Let's try something else. And I think you'll find some interesting things in some of these experiences. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about is, I don't know, again, how many of you are experts in New Testament scripture. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, you read the letters of Paul, one of his ideas seemed to be to establish ongoing operations that were fit the locality, they were independent and self-sustaining. For instance, he was quite willing to take people who had very recently become Christians and have them run the local Christian group. But you had a local, self-sustaining, ongoing operation. I think the brothers developed such a tradition. And of course, the term that we use among the brothers is a district. What was meant by a district? Well, it would be a number of schools and apostolates, not one. Had the brothers said, we'll stay in Santa Fe and won't go anyplace else, well, someone would have said, well, you don't build a district that way. What you do is you have a number of nearby related institutions. You educate the young men there. One of the important things you do is attract some young men to join those who are running the schools you have, and then you set up a training program for them. And of course, after you train these young men, they become the ones who staff and man the schools and, if necessary, expand the work. So there was this tradition of trying to establish a district. And the brothers who came to the Southwest seemed to think that, well, this is a Catholic area, a very Catholic area as far as the United States was concerned at this time, and that establishing a district here should be possible. So let's get busy with it. Let's see what we can do. Now, for instance, sometimes these efforts were very well directed, very well intentioned, and not much came for them. I'll very briefly mention what happened in my hometown of New Orleans. The brothers there wanted to establish a district. And what they did both before and after the Civil War was establish schools in other localities around New Orleans. However, one of the problems they had was yellow fever. All the brothers teaching in a given school could die of yellow fever during one of the bad summers. And of course, replacing men constantly like that gets to be quite a problem. The second thing is, of course, if you remember, after 1865, the economy of the South was in very poor shape. They would try to start schools, and they simply could not finance them. So the school would disappear. And what happened was they did try to establish a district there, and eventually they were forced to say, we can't do it. And that, well, the reason I mentioned the New Orleans district, or the attempt at the New Orleans district at this point, is this will come up in our story again this afternoon. But in other words, what the brothers did in Santa Fe, or tried to do in the Southwest, was not unique. Someone could have said, well, nobody else tried to do this. You tried it. It didn't work. Well, of course, once again, when I finish this presentation, there might be a question. What they did, were they being realistic? And of course, sometimes you can be too realistic. Sometimes you're not realistic enough. And that you're too realistic, you don't do anything. You're not realistic enough, you try something that doesn't work. There was an effort to establish a district out here in the Southwest. And this district lasted from 1867 to 1882, and then it came to an end, and it was probably about all they could do, unfortunately. So keeping that in mind, these efforts to establish a district, I'm going to start with efforts outside of Santa Fe, some of which were really inside of Santa Fe in some ways. Now, the first thing we might want to think about is, suppose somebody told you to open a school tomorrow. What would you need to open a school? If someone also told you, the school you open, we want it to continue, to survive, to prosper, what would you need? And of course, if you sat down and thought about that, you might decide, I'm not the person to try opening schools, or in this situation, I should not try to open a school, and it's not going to work. Excuse me. Now, there's another thing here which possibly affected what was done here in the Southwest. Until 1904, we were a French religious order. In 1904, there were 14,000 brothers, 10,000 of them in France, 4,000 in the rest of the world, including the ones that were here. And that the French brothers had a tendency to see how things work there. Well, we have a tendency to see how things work in the United States and then go ask, well, why can't they work that way somewhere else? But it worked in France, why can't it work here? What happened in France with regard to elementary schools was in 1833, a minister of education by the name of Guizot, don't get too hung up on the name, he had a law passed. Every town in France of a certain population, and it did not have to be that big, had to have at least one elementary school for boys, one for girls. And that, of course, this would fit in with the compulsory free elementary education being required of the children. Now, each area that had to start a school was told, this is your problem. You start the school. In France at this time, in the rural areas, people were very heavily Catholic. In the cities, you had a movement away from religion, but out in the rural areas, you had a very heavily Catholic area. And in a number of these rural, semi-rural communities, the brothers were asked to open the school for boys. And they would staff the school for boys. Some order of sisters would be asked to open the school for girls, and they opened the school for girls. By the way, there was a second provision. France is divided into 89 departments. Each department had to have 2 teacher training institutions, one for men, one for women. You might notice coeducation hadn't made much progress at this time. And in a couple of departments, the brothers were asked to conduct the teacher training colleges. Now, of course, you ran one of these schools, your salary was paid by the government. And since the government had to keep the school going, you had a school going, you had it established, the government would, provide the building, provide the furnishings, provide what you needed, pay the salaries. You might say, well, if I was asked to start a school under those conditions, I think I could pull it off. I could do it. And of course, the French brothers had done this in many places. And the idea, perhaps, that, well, why can't we do this in the United States? Why can't we do this, particularly in a Catholic area like around Santa Fe? It's possible. So I wonder if that was not some of the thinking. Now, at the time we're talking about, immediate pre-Civil War, remember the brothers came here 1859, what I call the U.S. Northeast, north of the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi, there was a very definite move to establish public school systems in each urban area, and some, maybe we'd call them somewhat rural areas. You would have schools that were supported by the government, and that there was also provisions for free, compulsory elementary education. Parents had to send their children to school. And depending on the local economy, the Northeast area I just mentioned was probably the richest in the country at the time. They could find the money to start these schools, maintain these schools, and they did. You move down south in what became the Confederacy of the Civil War, you'd have found these school systems much more scarce. In New Orleans, once again, you'd have found the schools. You went out in a rural area, you wouldn't find the schools. And in an area like New Mexico, which was very definitely not that well off if you look at the economic basis, probably you'd have said it was very difficult to start the schools. Now, there was another question which came up in starting these schools, and it very definitely affected the brothers. Under the First Amendment, there's this famous idea of separation of church and state. By the way, I have bumped into a couple of constitutional scholars who would tell you they're not sure what that was supposed to mean. They're not sure what it means today. And they think the way it's interpreted today was not the way it was meant when they wrote it. But of course, what this meant was that the government could not give any support to any church, and that a church-related school would be then unconstitutional, illegal. So what you had in France with these communes starting an elementary school for boys and turning it over to the brothers, and probably as long as the brothers kept it going, they were never bothered. But you couldn't have this in the United States. However, there was another problem. In these schools where the majority of the population was non-Catholic, various Protestant churches, and often they were anti-Catholic, in these public schools, you had Bible reading every morning from what many Catholics would have said was the notorious King James Bible. And if Catholic students attended these public schools, because they had to, there were no other elementary schools available, they would find themselves reading the King James Bible in the morning. So, of course, Catholic parents, very often prompted by the clergy, would protest against this. And of course, the Catholics, if they were numerous and had some political power, and by the way, some of the other American citizens noticed that some of the immigrants to the United States, particularly the Irish, seemed to take to politics like fish take to water and started exercising political influence. Well, they would want to have schools that were public schools, supported by the government, in which you would have a religious instruction every day, but Catholic religious instruction. There was quite a fight over this, and in general, in spite of the efforts of a few bishops to see if we can't work something out here, let's not have a fight over this, nobody's really going to win, that the Catholics generally lost out on this. So what did this mean? Well, among other things, it meant that when Santa Fe started talking about having public schools supported by the government, there could be no religious instruction. Of course, they ran into one other little problem. How do you run a school when you can't find any teachers to staff the school? And this was a problem they were facing. So the brothers were for a while on the St. Michael's College campus teaching 2 classes of public school students. And of course, I suspect, well, everybody knew they were brothers. Probably all the students were Catholic, and they were probably given religious instruction. This went on for a few years, but eventually the government decided in 1870 this simply couldn't go on. However, finding women teachers apparently was even more difficult than finding men teachers. The Sisters of Loretto continued running some of the public schools in Santa Fe until 1892. And then, of course, they were forced out. Excuse me, this is no good. Okay. Now, also in connection with these schools, a brother Patrick, who was connected with the St. Michael's College, for 40 years, he was a member of the Santa Fe School Board. eventually he resigned because he found out he was the only Catholic on the board, or the only one with any Catholic leanings, and that some of the actions of the school board he felt were anti-Catholic. He protested against these. So how would I summarize all this? There was a movement in the late 19th century to have free, compulsory elementary public schools. Students would be required to attend. The brothers became involved in this as a means of trying to expand their apostolate, but they ran into the problem, which was nationwide, that the anti-Catholic forces simply wouldn't allow this, and so the brothers missed this opportunity to expand their work, affect more people, reach more people, because of this movement, this conflict in the public school situation. This did not stop the brothers from attempting to open schools elsewhere. And again, if you're familiar with the area here, one of the most important places during this time was Taos. Let's see, who was the most famous person associated with the history of Taos at this time? Kit Carson, who married a Catholic and apparently converted to Catholicism. There seems to be a little question on this, but it seems like this is what happened. Anyway, Taos looked like a very promising place. The parish priest asked if the brothers could open an elementary school there. Some brothers were available, some brothers who had recently come from St. Louis. So in 1865, these brothers went there, opened a school, and it looked like the school had possibilities. However, the number of students turned out to be a very serious disappointment. And of course, the number of students who could pay even a minimum tuition was perhaps more of a disappointment. The school only lasted 2 years. The brothers, only 2 years. The brothers simply had to say, the pastor wants a school, we want a school here, but it is humanly impossible to support the school. So we will have to just get out. There's nothing we can do, okay? Another place that seemed to be very important and might be attractive for a school, and again, there was a request that the brothers go there, was Mora, Father South Point, who would have a big role in the history of the church out in this part of the world, asked the brothers if they could open a school there in 1865. They did, and for a couple of years, he was very interested in finding any way you could find tuition to support this school, find money to keep it going. However, he was then assigned to Arizona, and whoever replaced him was perhaps not as good at raising money. I'm sure we all know some people seem to have a knack there that is almost unbelievable, or was not that interested in raising money for the school. So the school went through one crisis after another. The school opened in 1865. It closed in 1884. Well, you might say that was a pretty long career. During this time, 5 different brothers tried to run the school and make it a success. And it seems that each one found difficulties and was discouraged and maybe asked, well, could somebody else come in? Maybe I'm not doing things right. He could do things. The brothers who came in very often worked hard. They were very zealous about their work, and some of them were more successful than others. Now, it is not impossible that the local economy was going up and down, and that when it was up, the school was able to find the money and things were pretty good. When it went down, very often the school was one of the first to not to start losing money, not have money. Some brothers came from California, and they had an idea. Maybe there's a boarding section here possible. We would have boarding students, they'd pay their room and board, and we'd make some extra money, and we'd get more students, and we'd keep this going. They got a few boarders, but not enough anyway to solve financial problems. And they also found out something else. St. Michael's College was prospering, doing well, because of the income from boarders. So if you took boarders in Mora, you might be competing with St. Michael's, which was not good for either school. And finally, it was acknowledged in 1884 that first the building needed tremendous work, and this would cost a lot of money. They hardly had enough money to support the brothers and to keep the school going, so where were you going to get the money to fix up the school building? Not possible. There was simply no way to keep the operation going. The last brother director had another interesting little problem. There were debts to local people who had given the brothers credit for maybe a number of months, maybe even for more than a year. Well, if we're going to leave, it would be very proper to pay off these debts. Well, some money was found, and I think St. Michael's College, Brother Botulf, put up the money necessary. We pay off all the local debts. When we left, nobody could say, you owe us any money, which was a very, good way to wind things up. The debts owed to the brothers, the debts owed to the institute, which had probably provided money to get the school started, these were simply written off. There was no way you could find the money. So you would have to say in both Taos and Mora, it seemed that people wanted schools there. The brothers were very interested in opening schools. After all, they wanted to expand the apostolate, establish a district. But they simply found that financially, it was humanly impossible and had to call off the work. Now, while this was going on, Brother Botulf decided that what you needed was local people to staff the local schools. And he opened a training program for the brothers, which was then and now called a novitiate. And they started looking for young men who would begin the novitiate, go through the program. They would get some teacher training as well as religious formation, and they would start teaching in the schools. So there was an idea to try to do this. Among his other duties, besides running St. Michael's College, supervising all the brothers' operations, Brother Botulf was also asked to serve as the director of this training program. Eventually, even he said, there's more than one person can do. Another brother took over. And apparently they attracted few young men. Many of those they attracted never finished the program. And that the idea you were going to have a number of local New Mexico brothers to staff the schools just didn't seem to be practical. And once the railway was functioning on a regular basis, getting from St. Louis to the Santa Fe area became much more possible, much less inconvenient, and it was decided that they would team up the operations in New Mexico with the St. Louis district. Always, of course, with the idea that if things changed, then they would start setting up an independent district here, an independent operation. Needless to say, this never happened. But after 1882, the school in Santa Fe and two other schools I'm going to talk about were part of the St. Louis district. And you can find, if you start looking into the records of the brothers, a number of brothers from the Midwest who spent a number of years in Santa Fe, a number of years in the other schools. Some of them came back for 2 or 3 different tours of duty here. And so this was helped solve a personnel problem. Of course, it also meant that there was a certain limit on the apostolate here in New Mexico. So far, I've sort of dealt with the things that were tried, which were all good ideas. Involvement in the public schools, the school in Taos, the school in Mora, a training program for young brothers, and the things which you might say, well, they didn't seem to work out. And I have to agree with you. Now I would like to look first at one which was extremely successful. In 1872, a citizen of Bernalillo called Don Jose Leonardo Pereira asked the brothers, couldn't you start a school in Bernalillo for the local boys, poor boys, who have no other source of education? And the reason he was interested in doing this, his sons had been boarders at St. Michael's College. And apparently they came back, he thought, very well educated in many ways, and that the brothers who did this could do this for these poor boys, younger boys there in Bernalillo, and that this would be a good thing. And of course, he also said that you're going to need a little help to do this. Well, don't worry. He was probably the richest man in the area, or one of the richest for sure, that you need help, I'll give you the help. So let's go. Well, the problem was solved when two new brothers came from California, and one brother was sort of available. So Brother Botul said, I have three brothers. They were talking about three classes. We'll have a school in Bernalillo. By the way, for the brothers from California, Don Pereira had paid for them to get to Santa Fe. He was showing that he meant business. On the 6th of December, 1872, the brothers opened St. Nicholas School in Bernalillo. The school started almost in as interesting a way as the school started in Santa Fe. It was half of Don Pereira's house. This is where the brothers taught school, and this is where they lived. And that the people gave a very good response. At the end of the first year, they had 92 pupils. Hold your breath on the next one. The youngest was 7 years old. The oldest was 26. Somebody had decided, I need education, which of course probably told the brothers, there's a need for education here. If we can provide education, and good education, there are great prospects here. And the school started taking off, and Don Pereira realized, just a moment, this half my house situation has no great future. We need a school. Well, how are we going to get a permanent building? Well, he contacted the local justice of the peace, who was probably one of the most prominent citizens in Bernalillo. He contacted the local sheriff, who was equally prominent, and they agreed with him. We got to do something. We have to contribute to this. What are we going to do? Well, Don Pereira's people would direct the work. Each man in Bernalillo was assessed 200 adobe bricks, which he was supposed to bring, and these would be used in the construction of the school. And apparently, the men, might have taken a little while, started providing the adobe bricks. One of Don Pereira's foremen would direct the work. He sent a carpenter to do the carpenter work that was necessary, and that the new building came up. Oh, they need school furniture? He provided that. If you think about one patron, you think about the local citizens, you think about this as a civic movement, the justice of the peace and the sheriff and the citizens kicking in. I wonder if there was ever another school in the whole institute built in this fashion. Because when the work was finished, they had 3 classrooms where the 3 brothers could teach, and 3 rooms where the brothers had their bedrooms. And this was the original plant for St. Nicholas in Bernalillo. In 1875, the school was ready to go, only 3 years after it started. Okay? And from 1877 until 1902, notice one of these long-term appointments, there was a brother Gabriel who directed the operation, and he made the school go very well, and the things were going very successfully. Probably Don Pereira was making sure that they had the funds to keep the school going, and prospects looked very good. Then something else happened, which was probably unexpected. Sandoval County, in which Bernalillo is located, decided they had to set up a public school system. And of course, they probably found out that the money to do this was in very scarce supply. Well, they had a solution. The brothers were asked if they would make their elementary school the public elementary school for boys. And they agreed. So the brothers who taught there were now public school employees, paid regularly by the county for teaching the school. And apparently nobody had any objections to this. By the way, I might mention one other thing to which I'll return later. The Sandoval County was not the most affluent county in the state of New Mexico. And the salary the brothers were getting was probably somebody would have said, well, you can live on it, but nobody's ever going to get rich on this salary. At the same time as this, the Sisters of Loretto were running the public school for girls, the elementary school. And when finally somebody got the idea about, hey, maybe we need some secondary education, because there were so few students interested in going after the elementary education, when the secondary school was opened, the nuns ran the secondary school for girls and boys, and this continued up to almost 1950. So we had a very interesting situation, the brothers always said. There was an elementary school for boys run by the brothers, alongside of an elementary school and high school, elementary school for girls, high school for boys and girls, run by the Sisters of Loretto. And a brother, James Lawrence, continued the good work of Brother Gabriel. So the school here was doing quite well. And apparently nobody got excited about any separation of church and state. Nobody started yelling about get the sisters and the brothers out of these schools. Of course, somebody might have told them if they yelled that, you bring the teachers and they'll be fine. And whoever was told, you bring the teachers, possibly said, well, that was a great idea, but can't do it. So the Bernalillo School was a very successful expansion of the Brothers Apostolate. And if you think about the first three brothers who went there, living in half of somebody's house, probably teaching in the same rooms where they slept, and then making such an impression on the local people that they were willing to chip in and build a school for them. And Don Ferrero was interested in keeping it going till the public school system stepped in. You would say this was a very successful expansion of the Brothers Apostolate in New Mexico. Okay? The other place we're going to talk about is Las Vegas, New Mexico. By the way, I was in Las Vegas, New Mexico for 1 year. I had to tell all my friends and family when I said I was in Las Vegas, I was not in the Las Vegas they knew, Las Vegas, Nevada. That we said our place was a little bit different from the one you were thinking about. Okay. In 1875, the Jesuit fathers opened a college, secondary school in Las Vegas, and apparently bringing in boarders, offering some post-secondary education. They found out that things were going pretty well. Then there was an economic boast to the situation. 1877, the railroads reached Las Vegas, and Las Vegas became a major point in the railway system. However, the Jesuit fathers, looking around, decided that the future here was not as great as it originally looked. Is there some place else we could look? And Denver attracted their attention. So they decided to move to Denver, and they closed their school, and there was now no Catholic education in Las Vegas. What was going to happen? Well, Archbishop Salpointe asked the brothers, Bishop Salpointe asked the brothers, well, couldn't you open a school in Las Vegas? And I will be able to give you support. However, he found out a point I made before, that Lamy had found out, that local money was not that abundant, money from outside was not that abundant, and then when he left another assignment, they found out that financing the school was a constant fight, that money was scarce, and that the future of the school was up in the air. They started with only 17 students, but by the end of the year, they were up to 90 students, which, among other things, suggests, once again, people were looking for education. However, apparently, once again, in the 1880s, there were several of these financial crises in New Mexico and in the West caused by lack of rain, drought. And Las Vegas was very hard hit. The first thing that would happen is the number of students would go down. Second, those who were attending seemed unable or unwilling to pay their tuition. So how do you keep the school going, financially speaking? There was also something else which the brothers noticed. There may or may not have been laws requiring students to attend school until a certain age. If there were such laws, there was nobody enforcing them. And as a result, you had many students or many young people. You would have said, well, they're of school age, they should be in school. They weren't. And on farm families, nobody raised any fuss about this. Very often, a school year in the Las Vegas area at this time did not run more than 4 months. So if you had a large number of students paying tuition, in 4 months you were supposed to collect enough money to keep the school going for 12 months. This would be quite an achievement. So this was always a place where the brothers were poor. On the other hand, they were very happy and devoted to their work. In 1957, one of the brothers who was connected with this school in its last years wrote a very interesting account of this school, which was published in one of the official publications of the brothers, Bulletin des Écoles Chrétiennes, Bulletin of the Christian Schools. When I read it, I said, well, now I have a pretty good idea of what happened in Las Vegas. I really think it should be translated into English and made available because I think, again, it could tell a lot of people some of the history of the brothers here. The brothers tried everything you could think of and a few things you might not think of to keep the school going. For instance, evening classes, because they discovered there were adults who wanted more education. However, the same brothers who were teaching elementary school during the day also found themselves trying to teach these adult classes at night, and it simply became too much of a burden. They couldn't do it, and they couldn't get more brothers. And of course, if they asked for more brothers, someone would have probably asked, well, you can't support the ones you have here now. How are you going to support additional brothers here? Again, they got the idea of trying a boarding section, but did not attract enough boarders, and probably the boarders who were better off were all going to St. Michael's College. So this was not an answer to the situation. Like in Taos before, a number of brothers took over as, to use the modern language, the chief administrative officers of LaSalle College, as they called it in Las Vegas, and they tried all kinds of things, keep the school going, that it's a successful school, it's serving the people. They found out that local people, non-Catholics as well as Catholics, were willing to help out. Apparently, there was some need for young men with a minimum of education to get into the local economy, and LaSalle College was producing young men like that. So, keep the school going. We'll help you raise money. And they did. But of course, they always found out that there were limits on this. The local economy was simply not that strong. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Catholic Extension Society. It was founded to help support Catholic Church operations in the less well-to-do areas. Brother Brian and I were supported by Extension Society, 87-88 school year. We offered courses they were providing to the lay workers in the school and the church activities in the Las Vegas area. Well, the Extension Society was working. When they were asked for gifts, they gave a couple of gifts of $200, one of $500, but even they were forced to say, we can't keep constantly pouring money into this operation. Sometimes the local brothers were paid for their activity. Farm people would bring them things from their crops, bring them an animal which they would either sell or slaughter to get meat. And this way things could sort of go on. But again, there were some problems. They had a 2-story building, which went back to the days when the bishop had thought, we can have a school and it can be a successful school. During each summer, the brothers were trying to find money. They provided the work to repair the facilities, and that they were finding this every summer. This was part of the problem, and that there was no end in sight in repairing the facilities. On several occasions, it is recorded that the local community treasury got down to $5, and $5 didn't go that far even then. One of the most famous incidents brought out in this history of the school was that in 1910, the brother director was supposed to go to Europe for what was called the Second Novitiate, an advanced training program for brothers. Whichever community the brother was in, they were supposed to finance his trip to Europe. Well, the director of Las Vegas College was told to go to Europe. I remember with $5 in the treasury, that there could be a problem here. Local people found out about this, or somebody did, and announced there was a piano that was worth at least $300. It would be given to one of the most deserving citizens in the town who was doing the most for the town. It was then given to the brother director, who promptly sold it for $225, and he got the money then to make his trip to Europe. But would you say they were sort of living from hand to mouth, and that if someone would ask, well, what's the future? Someone would have said, well, there might be a future, but we sure got some problems to solve. One other thing should be mentioned. I said there'd been a serious effort to recruit local brothers. And in some ways, local brothers would be the ones best qualified to deal with some of the situations here, work with the young men here, and maybe attract more young men to come to join the brothers. There was a brother, Diego Thomas, who was born in 1857, shortly before the brothers came here. 1872, he joined the brothers, made his novitiate, and shortly after that, he was sent to Mora to work there. He worked in the Mora school until it closed. Then he was sent to Santa Fe, and then to Las Vegas, and he would spend 25 years in Las Vegas, and mainly working at De La Salle College. He died here in Las Vegas. He died in Las Vegas on the 5th of January, 1927. The date always remains in my mind, because that was exactly 1 year before I was born. He was one of the brothers who, during the summer, with Brother Louis Gonzaga from the St. Louis district, they would do the repair work, and they would try to have the school ready. We can reopen with classes come September, October, whenever they could resume classes. And they were trying desperately to keep the school open. From everything I've said here, you'd have to say even the brothers who went to Bernalillo, who were well provided for, comparatively speaking. The brothers who went to Taos, the brothers who went to Mora, the brothers who hung on so long in Las Vegas were showing a real commitment to establishing our apostolate here, serving the people of New Mexico, and to make the work here a success. That you might say, well, the economic situation was simply against them. And maybe that's what you would have to say, and that was the only answer you could give. Now, all of this changed dramatically in 1916. In 1916, in events I'll discuss in much more length, starting at 1:30, it was decided that there'd be a new organization, a new situation here in the Southwest. A group of brothers would take over from the St. Louis district, which always considered this a way out, even with the railway, sending a brother to Santa Fe and then having him go back to St. Louis if that was necessary. It was quite an adventure. So you would have a group of brothers who were going to establish a permanent operation, a permanent apostolate here. And in 1916, 1918, this would happen. And this, of course, would change the situation of the brothers here in the Southwest, in New Mexico. I don't know if this has raised any questions, either the previous session or this one has raised any questions anybody would like to ask that they think might interest other people. Yes? Please, hearing from. School in Las Vegas? It closed in 1925.
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, when did the school in Las Vegas? 1925. I'll go into that this afternoon because it fit in with the new situation that was developing here. Yes? Question?
It seems to me that what you said, I'm 5 years older than you were.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah. I have no problem with that. I understand there's a fair hunk of the present United States population that's older than I am. Yeah?
This question is regarding St. Michael's College.
Yeah.
Were they training teachers? They were training teachers for other schools at St. Michael's College. Was there any knowledge of any type of degree that they received at that time?
Oh, I'm sure there was. Oh, the question is, when they had the public school at St. Michael's, was there any sort of pay they were receiving? Yes. That they were, again, of course, and so somebody raised the question of whether you could pay brothers or sisters, to teach in a public school.
What about the degrees of
One thing I asked about the degrees, the education of these men. I almost feel embarrassed when I think about these men and some of the things they did. They were largely self-educated. And maybe some of the lucky ones got a year of religious training and 1 year of teacher training, and we would hardly say they had much college education. They went out, started teaching, and educated themselves. And they educated themselves to incredible degrees. Like, for instance, this won't affect our story here very much. The brothers who became teachers of Latin and Greek, they taught themselves Latin and Greek to teach it. Brothers who taught themselves math and science, they taught themselves. One brother became known for his writing. He was self-trained. Now, you could do that at this time. Again, I'll talk about some aspects of that this afternoon. But you had men who not only undertook work that some of us might say, well, I admire them for doing that. I'm not sure I can imitate them. But you had people who educated themselves and became very competent. For instance, how much education, in our sense, did Brother Botulf have? And yet he was considered the best man to run the Territorial Board of Education and so on. So probably it was all self-acquired knowledge. So I think this is something to admire in these men, and it was probably very common at this time. Yes, Jim?
As a former student of yours, how long have you been a brother?
On August the 14th, I've been a brother 65 years.
This coming.
Yes. There are 3 members of my group still alive.
And did you study at the college?
Oh, yes, member of the class of 52. I was one of the first students at the college.
God bless you.
Yeah. Yes?
Was that school in Sandoval County, the school in Bernalillo, the town of Bernalillo itself, was that run by the Christian Brothers?
Yes. He asked for the school in Bernalillo, right?
Was that also called convent? Was that a convent also?
A what?
A convent. Later,
Well, there was a school for the Sisters of Loretto. Well, the schools in Bernalillo, yes. The Sisters of Loretto had their convent there, and they staffed the element. And the brothers had their residence there. They staffed it. And for years, everybody seemed to, well, this is how it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you, and